All right. Well, welcome back to the VIF podcast. Coming from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations here. And I'm here with Mark Mangini, who is a two-time Oscar winner for movies like Dune and Mad Max Fury Road, and a recent Emmy winner for the Amazon Prime documentary Good Night, Oppie. Other recent credits include the latest Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, Blade Runner 2049. The list goes on. And actually, I was looking back at it. I love looking at your legacy credits like The Lion King and Aladdin and classics like that and Fifth Element. And
were you the one that mentioned Solar Babies the other day?
No, I wasn't.
Somebody who's interviewing me brought up a very obscure Mel Brooks movie.
Oh, wow. Nice.
It's not worth remembering. So I'm sorry I brought it up.
Hey, no worries. Yeah. Maybe start, I'm not sure totally the audience of the podcast is going to be, but maybe tell us a little bit about the road to where you are today and how you got into sound, and maybe a little bit about like the formation of your company Weddington back in the day, and ultimately now you're at Formosa, and we share a little bit of that journey.
That's the 45 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
That journey is 45 minutes for sure.
Yeah.
Well, it begins in Boston, where I'm unhappy in college. I'm studying foreign languages and thinking that I'll be an interpreter. And I only chose that as my major because it was the only thing I did well in high school. And I thought I should go to college. That's what you do after high school.
Right.
But all through my childhood, I made movies. My dad gave me an 8mm movie camera, film camera, and I made almost all exclusively stop motion and hand-drawn animated short films. And that was truly my joy, but I wasn't connected to that. I don't know why, but I didn't connect that to, well, I love doing this. This is something I could do for a living. And so in my sophomore year of college studies, the light bulb went off, and I realized that I'm not happy doing this. What I love is movies, so I'm just going to drop out. That's what I did, dropped out of college and drove to Los Angeles with my car full of guitars because I was a musician as well, and thinking, well, there's plan B. I could be a musician maybe, even though I wasn't a very good musician at the time. And I would land my first job. I struggled for many months until one day the individual whose guest house I was renting, I bumped into him coming home, and he said, "How's job hunting?" "Not so good. What do you do? What do you like?" And I said, well, I used to make stop-motion animated movies with my dad's camera. And the next day I had an interview at Hanna-Barbera Studios.
Amazing.
The known Saturday morning children's cartoon studio that made such greats as Scooby-Doo and the Flintstones and things like that. And that first job would be in the sound department, fortuitously. That's not something I ordained or asked for. And in fact, in the interview, the executive at Hanna-Barbera had asked for my portfolio, thinking I was an artist. And I'm not. I'm a worse artist than I am a musician.
Yeah.
And anyways, so I got a job in the sound department as an apprentice, as a track reader, which is the individual that takes the recordings from the actors in the studio and transcribes them frame by frame to give the animators an indication of where the mouths should open and close, because you have to draw based on what the actor said. Sound comes first in animation,
which
we love.
Yes, that's right.
And that would turn into an offer to become a sound effects editor in that same department. And I really loved that and developed some really memorable and life and career-lasting skills as a cartoon or animation sound editor, skills that I still use today. And that lasted about 3.5 years. And then I saw Star Wars, and I connected the dots in my own life, which was, I do sound. Here's this amazing movie that uses sound in an important and narrative way. Maybe I could do something that good someday. So I rung my mentor, a man, Bill Kowalchuk, who had mentored me at Hanna-Barbera. He had gone to Paramount Studios, and I said, "Could you get me an interview?" And he did, and I got a job, knocked it down the rung a couple times again as an apprentice sound editor at Paramount Studios. And as fate would have it, I was apprenticing with their elder statesman in that department, and he was training me while he was working on Star Trek, the motion picture, the first Star Trek movie, theatrical release. And he would unfortunately fall really ill and have to leave the movie. And when Robert Wise, the director, asked who was going to replace him, he said, take the kid.
Right.
Because I had been training. I knew where all the bones were buried.
Right.
There were 10 other senior members of that department, but they hadn't been working on it. And if the director had asked a question, they wouldn't know how to answer it. So I was immediately bumped up from apprentice to sound editor to supervising ADR editor. I was the ADR editor, in fact, on that film.
Right.
And had a great run on that film where I met my future business partners, Richard Anderson and Stephen Hunter Flick. And we had such a good relationship and experience working together on Star Trek, we determined to strike off on our own and form a little sound company. And at that time in Hollywood, the studios, for the first time ever, were divesting themselves of departments.
Right.
I mean, at that time in the late 70s, the studios had a department for everything, for costume, for set construction, and sound. But they were discovering, because perhaps some accountant looked at the ledger sheet and saw that, well, we have these 10 people on salary, but we don't have enough films to support paying them all on a project, so maybe we should get rid of departments. And we saw that coming. So we formed a partnership and then a corporation that would be called eventually Weddington Productions. And with really the goal of, though we started off as a partnership because we loved working together and we knew we kind of overlapping skills. And our first couple of films were The Final Countdown, a weird time travel film with Kirk Douglas, and then Raiders of the Lost Ark, because my partner Richard Anderson had gone to USC Film School with Ben Burt, the well-known
Ben Burt. Yes, right? Everyone knows him.
Yeah. And that was working out great as a partnership. And then we were offered a film at MGM called Pennies from Heaven, a drama with Steve Martin. Steve Martin's first foray into drama. And the only way we could work for that studio was to be a corporation. So our hand was kind of forced into becoming a business. But what we discovered in that process was that we could control the quality of our work as a business that we couldn't do as independents and subbing out parts of our process like the sound recording and the sound transfer work. And it became a way for us to just do the kind of bespoke one-off work that we all wanted to do. None of us wanted to go back to studios and do the sort of assembly line process that most sound departments at the studios looked like. There was just a way you did it. It was really like an assembly line. A reel came in at one end and it went to a sound editor. They asked for sound effects and then they cut them in based on what they saw. And there was no interaction with filmmakers and no attempt to sort of tell stories with sound. And we wanted to do things differently. So the business side of it empowered us to develop a way of doing movies the way we wanted to do them, which began with lots of fresh recording. The first $1 that we made as a company was, let's go buy a Nagra. And by the way, this is a long time ago. This is analog tape and Nagras, and they were still state-of-the-art for that time, for 1979, 1980. And bought the best Schoeps and Neumann microphones. And we dedicated ourselves to following that kind of template that Ben and Walter Murch, very well-known film editor, sound mixer, and Alan Splett, who you may know, very famous David Lynch collaborator. They laid out the sort of the template for us, which was that the best soundtracks start with the freshest ingredients. And all of our peers were pulling from libraries, especially old, ratty, studio libraries that were made up out of optical sound recordings, not even magnetic recordings. Eventually we'd get to digital.
So you took everything and you recorded it yourself. You wanted to make sure that that was the philosophy, I guess, behind the new company.
That was a big part of it, was fresh recordings so that every movie felt new and original. And that gets us to, turning into a company. Did I miss anything in the timeline?
I don't think so. No, I think that was pretty good. Yeah. And then
I think that's the fastest I've ever told that story.
And then that lasted for many years.
25 years. We were a business, and then we were bought by Technicolor, the famous, lab. But I think Technicolor, they had to diversify into services because lab services, photochemical processing was disappearing in the late 80s. And they bought our company as one of many companies, and we became a division of theirs, and that was unsatisfying. We had lost our ability to control our destiny as, being owned by someone else. The joy of our business was that we were masters of our own ship. We could buy whatever equipment we wanted whenever we wanted and do it, and we didn't like being told what to do.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about 32 Sounds, because that's what brought you here, or part of what brought you here.
Yeah.
How does this kind of film, how does this collaboration come about with Sam Green? I mean, was this a concept that you helped him develop over time? Where did you come into the fold on this?
It's an interesting. This is the story I'm about to tell is a testament to what a progressive and intelligent filmmaker Sam Green is. And I'm not saying that to stroke myself to say because he hired me.
Right.
If it wasn't me, it would have been somebody else like me. We had a friend in common. I didn't know Sam, Jake Block, who had this hunch. Jake is this producer who just has senses about things. And he said, Mark, you got to meet my friend Sam. He didn't even know Sam was working on a film at the time. And he just set up a phone call between Sam and I for us to just talk to each other.
Yeah.
And that's when Sam would introduce the idea of 32 Sounds to me. In that first phone call, we really hit it off. We really liked each other as filmmakers. And in that phone call, he said, I'm making this film, and it's about sound. And would it be okay, we'll figure out a fee for me to call you every now and again and ask you questions, because he admitted that he didn't really understand a lot about sound, but he wanted to make a movie about sound. That says a lot about Sam as a character, because he felt compelled to follow a thread in his life that was sound at that moment,
right,
and discover it as he made his film. And I think that makes him a really special filmmaker. And I agreed. I thought, well, this is great. He wants me to be engaged as he makes the film, as a collaborator, not just as a technical reference, like what microphones should we use, but we would discuss ideas for scenes he hadn't even shot yet. And he'd pitch the idea about, here's what I'm trying to get at about sound and the way we listen, and I want to shoot a scene about this. What do you think? And we would just have these great erudite conversations about film and sound and the scene itself and structure and the movie. And we would end up working that way for 9 months as he shot and completed the movie. And for maybe not the first time, but it's rare for me to be for sound, because sound, as you know, is called post.
Yeah.
It's post, meaning it comes after everything.
Right.
And it's deigned as being reactive. The movie's been made. Now here you add something to it. Here was an opportunity to be structurally responsible for what the audience would actually enjoy while they're watching the film. I could be a part of making the film, not to reacting to something that was already done. And that felt really refreshing. I thought, this is something I want to be a part of. It's a documentary. It was the first documentary I'd ever worked on. And usually documentaries don't engage sound that way. And Sam was prescient in that regard. And in spite of the lack of the kind of funds it would normally take for me to work on a film, it was more important for me to be a part of this film in spite of that. Because of the message it tells about sound and how sound affects us emotionally and how we relate to sound in our lives, that it was more important just to be a part of that.
Yeah. Well, it's your passion and also Sam's passion at the time. And it just seemed like he reached out to the perfect collaborator to help tell that in a lot of ways.
I think he did.
Yeah.
You tell me.
No,
How did it come out?
I mean, it was great. It was a very, very interesting experience. I'd never seen a live documentary like that before. And especially to also be passionate about sound and the spatial, the process of it. Like, were you the mixer on the project as well? Like, can you tell me a bit about the mixing process? Are you mixing in headphones most of the time? Is it a little bit half and half? Because there is elements of it that is not with headphones.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, he envisioned it originally as a headphone experience. We had seen the Simon McBurney live piece that was like this. I'm blanking on the name at the moment, but I'll come back to it. And Simon did a live presentation with in fact, a binaural dummy head on stage and some live music. But Sam wanted to add this film component as well. So the original mix was a headphone mix, and it premiered at Sundance.
Right.
And Sam wanted to incorporate that idea of this very personal experience because you're kind of in your own little cocoon in the theater. But one of the advantages of headphones, is that you can shield out all the other ambient sound around you and get a very, very pristine reproduction of what we want you to hear. But it also allows us to use some techniques like binaural recording and other immersive sound techniques to give you something you can't get from open-air loudspeakers like you would in a cinema.
Right.
So we talked a great deal about that, and we knew we would build it binaurally for headphones, and that the way to complete the film would be on headphones. And that was a new experience for me. I was learning on the job.
Right.
I've been a narrative cinema sound designer for 47 years. That means I've always mixed in a big room with a console and speakers around me and in front of me, like you have in a cinema. But mixing for headphones is a very, very different beast. And I didn't have an aesthetic for it. I had never done it. But Sam was willing to do that with me and go on that adventure together. And he would come out from New York and sit with me in my studio in Hollywood, California, and we would inch through it together, finding ways to make sound for headphone be compelling. And that was really fun.
And are you doing that in Pro Tools as well?
Everything in terms of the build was done in Pro Tools, a nonlinear sound editing tool. And I worked, Robert Kello was one of my collaborators. He did the first couple of weeks of the sound edit and designed a fair amount of the film. And then we were trying to decide when we were going to finish. And then I realized that it hadn't gone as far as I wanted it to go. So I talked Sam into putting me on for another week. To do kind of a polish. Robert's work was stunning, but I had my own ideas that I wanted to contribute because at the time, Sam couldn't afford me to do the edit or the design work. Right. So he hired Robert, who's not cheap, and he's tremendous. But I talked him into, I want to do this and this and this in these scenes. So we added another week and a half for some additional editing and sound design. And then we just sat and mixed it together for about 5 days.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, I want to talk a bit, just kind of leading in from the conversation you had about the collaborative process in this film. There's this notion a lot of the time with post sound that it's a technical practice more than it's a creative practice. And I know a lot of people in the industry, such as yourself and many others, who are really trying to change that perception. So I'm curious, like, when filmmakers are going to engage you, or when they're like typically engaging you, how long you're working on a project for, how that can be different between, something like Dune as opposed to a drama like The Way Back or something like that, like is there, I imagine that the concept and the philosophies are similar, but maybe the timeline is different. So I'm curious to hear a bit about how you work in that sense.
Well, I know that sound as an integral part of pre-production and production isn't taught.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't, it's not even in the canon. You know, as I said earlier, sound is thought of as post. It comes after the shoot. And most filmmakers are content with accepting that as this is the way movies are made, and I probably shouldn't break from that tradition. There's probably a reason for it. But what they're neglecting is the value that sound brings to the kind of creative inception of a movie. I preach often that sound can and should be part of screenwriting, pre-production, and production.
Yeah.
And we've evinced that and shown it to be successful on movies like Dune and Blade Runner 2049 and Mad Max Fury Road. You know, often I'm sent... Now, let me contextualize that a little bit by saying I recognize that I live in a little bit of an ivory tower. Most productions can't afford, even if they thought it was a good idea, sound in the bigger sense. Can't afford, or they don't think they can afford sound to be an integral part of the screenwriting process or the pre-production process. But as we will discover, and maybe I'll get to some of these stories, sometimes the ideas that can be bred in pre-production and in writing can actually pay for themselves in ways that you wouldn't imagine. And they can also inform the storytelling in ways that the filmmakers hadn't thought of. I mean, can you imagine going to set and the cinematographer hadn't talked to the production designer, showing up and why is it green?
Right.
Why is it, or vice versa?
Yeah.
So it's odd that this one extraordinarily important component of filmmaking, sound, is left out of that collaboration.
Right.
Yes, of course there is sound. There's production sound. We've hired someone to capture, the sync sound during filming, but none of the focus is on the creative contribution, just as the DP and the production designer are having heady conversations about the meaning of this lens and what it says about, and why does the character have that color clothing? It speaks to this, something subliminal, there's subtext to their character there. None of that conversation is happening about sound in those same moments.
Right.
Why not?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so I'm a big believer in that. And as I've been able to be engaged by filmmakers like Denis Villeneuve and Sam Green, we're proving the value of that in so many ways. Yeah. So much so that I think we're helping filmmakers be better filmmakers and better storytellers, because sometimes sound can be more efficient than exposition. And anytime you can do that, you're being a really effective filmmaker.
Absolutely. Well, even on set, it's so much more than just the production sound, and I think that gets lost a little bit. And I mean, I'd love to see that concept and that ideology just start to be ingrained in filmmakers' minds more. And there are people out there, there are directors out there, obviously, that do think that way.
Yeah. I'll give you a quick example.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
There's just so many stories that I can tell about this.
Where did that really help shape an idea during production, even in production during shooting? Is there any thing that comes to mind in that sense?
Oh, boy, there's a lot of stories to tell. On Dune, Denis sent us the script in pre-production. The script had already been written. And then we met before he began shooting, and we started, tossing ideas around about the movie. And one of the things that really stuck out to me is that the Fremen, who are the native population of Arrakis, have their own unique language, but the script never addressed it. The script simply said we had the lines in English and then something in parens that spoken in Fremen. But Denis hadn't really thought that through, and I presumed when I read the script that they were thinking, well, we'll just dub it later.
Right.
And I said to him, we can make this so much more organic. We need to invent Fremen now, and you need to teach your actors how to speak Fremen, and it's going to now be organic to the movie, and all that means. And I knew of the linguist who had been hired for Game of Thrones to do all of those nativist languages, and he's just brilliant. I'll remember his name in a minute. And we hired him as our language advisor, and he would build an entire alphabet and a vocabulary and a pronunciation guide, so that so that the actors could actually listen on their mobile devices their lines in the language as spoken with the correct accents and all those kinds of things. And it's just, sometimes it's small things like that add texture that you couldn't get if it was like some kind of a pertinence in post-production.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a thought about that. So on a movie like Dune, are you engaged from that pre-production phase, and are you in it for however long, from the beginning to the end? Yeah,
one of the things I love when I think back about Denis is that when we first met on Blade Runner 2049, it was not his first big budget movie, but it was a really big budget movie.
Yeah.
And he told us that he had dreamt his entire filmmaking life of a universe where sound was part of production, and that sound would work collaboratively with the picture editor to build the first cut.
Right.
Because he understood how they could inform each other, and how it also relieved him of the burden of waiting till post to see how sound might inform his film. So he had built that into the architecture of the budget as he on Blade Runner, as he did on Dune. And we would embark on a process of sound design, music creation, score creation, and VFX creation from day one of shoot.
Right.
And all of those components were collaborative and symbiotic. And so there are a number of beats in Dune where Joe Walker, the editor, would turn over a scene and say, I need sound for the shields.
Right.
There's a lovely set piece early in the film where Paul Atreides learns how to use the shield. And none of us knew what it would sound like, nor did anyone know what the shields would look like. One thing we did know was that we didn't want to follow an old school tradition of shields or like force fields. Like it wasn't going to be like the first Dune where it's like a golden cocoon that protects the occupant. We knew we didn't want that, and we didn't want some incessant like humming force field that is protecting this individual. So that gave rise to this idea that Theo Green and I worked on, which was that you would only see and hear the shield when it needed to present itself. It was always there, but you knew it was protecting you when a strike was anticipated. So Theo and I started working on some sounds, and we came up with a couple of really interesting kind of static, electric kind of sparky sounds that we knew Frank Herbert had discussed in his description of the shields because he was a scientist. And so we made these sounds and we sent them to the Joe Walker, the editor, and he put them in, and Denis loved them so much so that became the template for the visual effects. He said, we've solved the problem. I'm going to have where, like, if Paul was about to the shield was struck and it had to deploy, you would hear like a that meant that the visual effect now had to animate to that sound, and they drew a sound that pulsed according to the modulation of our sound, and that would beget a collaboration between visual effects where we would feed off each other. We sent them the first sounds. They came back with their version of what that would look like. Denis would weigh in on how successful that was. We would reiterate because they would add a new twist, like a color. So how does color change the nature of the sound that we had already created? Now we made a shift and came up with an idea of if the shield was about to go through, the weapon would go through the shield, there would be an alarm, and that would trigger another look on the shield. And so you can see this iteration process that we went through that became something that now I think yielded a very organic moment. When you see the scene, I believe, that it all feels of a piece. Like, oh, of course, it couldn't have been anything else, and everything is working together. None of that could happen without us working, starting from production on, to collaborate. If the tradition in my community is that because we're post, visual effects hands us something that's done. Here's a spaceship flying by. Here's a creature roaring. Now add your sound to it.
Yeah, designed to that.
Designed to that. But what if I wanted the creature's voice to go and have like a wiggle to it? Well, it's too late. It's already animated.
Right.
So we believe in this much more organic process. And it just tickled Denis because he said this is something he had been dreaming of his entire career.
Right. Yeah.
And now it was working.
Yeah. And is this kind of collaboration and the foresight to have this kind of collaboration, does that help inform like kind of what projects you agree to work on and take on?
Not I mean, if I don't think it's happened yet where I had two offers and one of them offered this collaboration. I mean, it seems self-evident that if I did have two offers, I'd take the one with the collaboration and not the other. Yeah. I haven't been quite that lucky so far.
I'm surprised, yeah.
The fun thing about my career is that I've done, comedies like Anchorman, and I've done animated films like The Lion King and Beauty and the Beast. All of that builds my design muscles.
Right.
The skills that I develop in design for comedies support the skills that I need when I'm designing for a science fiction film. So I like to take all of that on, and in fact, I really believe that if I just stayed in science fiction, I'd get really stale, and I'd start recycling ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. What's your overall philosophy? And I guess in that sense is like when you start to design a new film or a scene even, and how does that process change? Just like what you're saying, like all these different genres help inform others. Like how does that process, or does it change at all when you're doing something like a comedy versus a science fiction?
Well, some things are universal, and that is my job is to tell story with sound and to use the tools that I have to bring that about. A cinematographer tells stories with image, and their tools are lenses and aperture and lighting. And so but the commitment is to making sure that, let me back up for a second. In any film that I work on, no sound is an accident. There is intention with everything that I do. And I want to make sure that if I'm adding sound or subtracting sound, an important concept, because sound design isn't just additive. It's not. It's not like a frosting you put on a cake. It's the idea that, well, what shape should the cake be in the first place? Should it be round or square or flat or tall? But my goal is to ensure that I have a reason for every sound being, and I always do. If you asked me even the most inconsequential sound, like why that footstep, I could tell you why it's there and why it sounds the way it does, and there will always be a reason for it that has some connection to the story, even if it's very loosely. Yeah. And so I allow that idea, that concept, to inform everything that I do. That makes soundtracks that work the best because there's a reason for being for everything. And so once I've kind of achieved what I call the why, why sound, the how becomes a lot easier. If I know why a sound needs to exist, I have a really good clue as to how I'm going to make it. So it's always what's on the screen. And I would like to think that if you asked my peers and the filmmakers that I work for, they'd tell you that when I'm not only the sound designer, but the re-recording mixer, the person who makes the decisions about, oh, here's all these sounds, we really are going to use this one, and here's how we're going to play them. I am dispassionate with the work that I've done, as hard as that is to do. And I know it's hard for any creative person to see maybe something they designed for a month just go away in a poof
Right.
because it doesn't land. We're all looking. I'm pointing to an imaginary screen, but you can't see this. I'm pointing to an imaginary screen in a mixing theater, and I'm saying if it doesn't land up there on the screen, it doesn't belong in the movie.
Right.
And I will be the first to say, doesn't work. I'm taking that out.
Taking it out. Yeah.
Yeah, made a mistake.
Well, that's actually my next question is what if any factors play into the decision to strictly supervise a film or also take on the mixing role?
Sure.
Because that's like, those two things are very different, obviously, and but they go hand in hand so easily as well.
Yeah. Well, it's really binary. Very often filmmakers have teams that they've worked with in the past, and they want to maintain those relationships. And I totally respect that. If a filmmaker comes to me and says, Mark, I'd love you to mix this, but I just worked with X and X, and they're great, I would be the first to say, let's do, that, love those two or those three or that one, and let's do that. And in some sense, it's a little bit of a relief of a burden because it's hard work to be a designer and a mixer. There's a lot of sonic weight on your shoulders. The flip side of that is that I really believe that in doing both of those disciplines and trying to do them really well, I'm being kind of the best avatar for the filmmaker's wishes as I can possibly be. I've already, by the time we get to the mix, I've had a month, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months of employing, of evincing the director's vision for the project. And I don't need to, if it were the traditional paradigm of we bring in some mixers we really like, there's an unfamiliarity with the project and there's a certain amount of inertia to overcome.
Right.
They need to listen to everything and they need to understand the reasons for these sounds being, and I'm already there. And now the filmmaker can speak a lot of shorthand with me. Mark, remember when we played those sounds of the worms? Oh, I know where you're going. Okay, and I'm already there.
Absolutely, yeah.
So there's an efficiency there that I think yields perhaps a more efficient result. I can't say better because there's so many great re-recording mixers, but I can maybe get there a little bit faster, thus leaving more time for other important things to get done instead.
Yes, that is a very good way of putting that. I saw recently that sometimes with approach to mixing, it's like just get through a pass of it and sit and do a couple things, move on, and then it leaves you time to come back and reflect and watch the whole thing through and then make changes. And I think it's a really interesting way of approaching it because it's so easy to get caught in a scene or
you get stuck in the weeds.
Yeah, you get stuck in the weeds. Exactly.
We are huge believers in that. And there's something uniquely biological or psychological going on there, where let's say the budget ordains 2 weeks for your final mix, and you've got 5 20-minute A/B reels. So you mathematically apply, 2 days per reel, and you kind of stick that. And by the time you get to day 10, you're at the very end, and you have no concept of what you've done from a bird's eye view perspective of you haven't. What you want to be able to do is, I think, respond to your first instincts and get through a very quick pass, and then you need to get away for a weekend and have a life and forget about the being in the trenches. And then when you come back that Monday on the 6th day, you look at it with a different eye, a very different eye than if you had gotten to day 10 and just finished reel 5. And the perspective that yields sometimes, and it happens for the sound designers, it happens for the composers, and it happens for the directors in a huge way. And even more importantly, one of the best services you can do yourself is to get it even out of the mix room. Take it out of its context and go see it in a theater, like a cinema. Even if the cinema isn't perfectly lined up, maybe that's an example of how it's going to play in the real world.
Maybe that's okay,
and maybe that's really good for you. Maybe all that low end you were trying to push through doesn't play in a normal, and maybe we can rethink that, or the acoustics are different, and all of a sudden you're seeing it as an audience member. You're out of that environment of the workroom that you're in, and it feels different, and now you approach it differently.
Well, it is so interesting because you know, and it's probably different. Maybe you're moving around stages a lot, but to be in a stage and know a room really well and constantly just be there and not take it out to see how it translates can be hard. You know, you don't know how it's going to go. So I think taking it out and getting that perspective is super important because
it shouldn't be hard. I mean, what's the fear there? What do you think people would worry about? Filmmakers are gonna.
Oh no, I guess I mean like you can get stuck in the room that you know, and you don't know how it's going to translate. So it's saying that if you take it out, you gain that perspective and you come back and you can kind of learn your own room better.
Yeah.
How things are sounding.
Well, definitely from a technical standpoint, as the person who's technically responding, is it high fidelity? Is it is the dynamics correct? Are the dynamics correct? All of that gets learned by taking it out in the real world. But you know, it almost seems self-evident, and yet it's not well practiced. I mean, there's no studio in Hollywood that would, unless it's an auteur director, that wouldn't take the director's cut and test it with an audience. Right. Why would you not want to know what real human beings think of your film versus just what you think of it? Now, there's some great filmmakers who can do that. Yeah. But it's rare. Yeah. And the whole concept of testing is undervalued in cinema. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this undergirds that idea that get out of your space, get out of your environment. Yeah, for sure. There's this really great moment in 32 Sounds. So I'll go back to this, where earlier in the film, you show a tree falling with no sound, and then you revisit it later once Joanna. Joanna Fang. So Joanna Fang, who's incredible just in the movie. She's so great. Create these elements through Foley, and what I wanted to ask you was, will you often collaborate with your Foley teams when you're designing sound effects for a film outside of the typical like footsteps, cloth props type effects? Yeah, it depends. I never get the kind of budget I want on Foley, except for movies like Dune and Mad Max. In fact, on Dune, we would discover that dune sand, desert sand, is very different from beach sand. And Andy Malcolm, who has my favorite Foley studio in Toronto. In fact, I've been working with Andy Malcolm for 20 years. And he's my go-to Foley team. Nice. And Sandra Fox and Goro Koyama, three brilliant Foley artists, and they're all Canadian. Amazing. Is that, what's the company called? Footsteps Studios. Yeah, I've heard of them, yeah. They're really tremendous, and they've been incredible collaborators with us for so long. And Andy, I knew this, Theo knew this, my partner on it, that we had gone to the Mojave Desert and we had done initial footstep tests in desert sand, and we knew what that sounded like, but we wanted Andy now to take the film, under his wing and do it his way. But the thing we stumbled on was desert sand. He couldn't get desert sand. Right. He had dump trucks coming to his studio, which is like 80 miles outside of north of Toronto, and leaving, a ton of sand, and he would record with it, but all he could get was like when the winter comes and you got to put sand and salt down so that the ice doesn't accumulate on the roadways. That was the only kind of sand you could, and it was the wrong texture. Too thick. And it took 3 passes to get this really fine, like silica-based sand to get the right sound. And what we noticed when we went into the desert is that when you plant your foot in desert sand and you lift it, a little rooster tail comes up because the sand is so fine. It doesn't do that with traditional beach sand or playground, play box sand. And we had to have that on because Denis had heard it while shooting, and we know is an aspect of the sand. Yeah. But to answer the question directly, I usually don't leave the big signature sounds to Foley unless I think there's a really important way that they can do it. But, I don't usually leave creature voices to Foley. You don't think of that as a Foley-like sound. But the sounds of footsteps and sand was an essential component to our movie. We spent a lot of time on that. I'm trying to think. I mean, the Foley artists are collaborators, and as I expect from my filmmakers, so do I provide for the Foley artists. I send them the film and with very little instruction because I trust them as artists and as I want to be trusted as an artist, and say, give me stuff.
Here you go.
And sometimes the best design work are the things that, you know, Andy or Sandy or Goro, they would come up with an idea and present a shield sound or a, you know, whatever, or worm burrowing under the desert.
Yeah.
And I'm pleasantly surprised. And I think they had the light bulb went off and they had to like scratch an itch. They had to explore something.
And that can help inform maybe what you're doing as well.
It either relieves me of one of 400 things I have to do. Check. All right.
Exactly,
I don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, no doubt. How do you keep up with the latest technology trends, and what are your thoughts on the AI integration in sound design and how that will impact our industry? That might be a loaded question. That's another 45 minutes.
No, I just want to think of an intelligent way to respond. I want to say what I believe in a way that by the nature of my work, I must interact with technology. I cannot work without computers and workstations and plugins and microphones and digital sound. So there is a universe where I need to be current as I can be with modern equipment. But you will notice today, as in yesterday, as in anything you might have listened to that I had something to do with, I will never put technology before creativity. My message is always develop the creative skills and the technology will follow. You know, you might say that I don't know who just won the Tour de France this year, but they didn't win the Tour de France because they knew how to ride a bicycle. They won the Tour de France because they knew how to stage a properly planned attack and they knew how to win a race, which is the way of saying they know how to tell a story. I will always send a young sound designer to classes to develop storytelling skills before I would have them study the manual on Pro Tools or something like that. The technical skills will always follow. You'll get them. And you will never get a job because you've mastered them.
Right.
Because it means you are just one of a faceless number of individuals who are technicians.
Yeah.
And no filmmaker wants to hire a technician. What a filmmaker wants to hire is a collaborator, someone who understands their creative vision, someone who understands the story that they're telling. So if you took a screenwriting class, you're so far ahead of the pack as a sound designer. If you took a cinematography class, you're so far ahead of the pack. Because I learn, when I watch a movie, I learn from what I ask myself, why did the costumer use red for that character? Oh, that means this, and that means there's this subtext for that character. How can I use that subtext, and what sound undergirds that when I want to deploy it? Why did the cinematographer not light the corner of the room? Why did they use a long lens instead of a short lens? All of these are tells that either give you a clue as to what their creative process was or what the director's creative process was, and they interpreted it with their craft and their equipment.
Yeah.
So I think it's so much more vital. You have to have a serviceable understanding of the technology, but you should never be a slave to it.
Yeah, absolutely. You've had a 47-year career.
No, I still have one.
You still have one. No,
I'm not dead yet.
Sorry, yes.
Or in Monty Python speak, I'm not dead yet.
You've had and are continuing. If you had to start again now, would you do anything differently?
You're the second person to ask me that. It's such a good question, actually. And I think I fumfered in the last interview when I was asked. I guess the short answer is no. I could not be happier with my career because I've achieved everything I ever wanted to achieve. I feel like I'm working kind of at the highest level on films that my family can go see and brag about to their friends. Oh, my son did this. And and I am working in a way that I feel deeply satisfied. I think it's pretty rare for anyone to be able to say, I look forward to going to work every day. What kind of good fortune is that?
Right.
So whatever brought me there, with all the toil and the turmoil and the trouble and the angst and the arguments with directors I didn't like, all of it was worthwhile because it got me here, which is a place of deep satisfaction and contentment. And I think there's sort of a life lesson, and I'll be like grandpa or dad for a second and say that there's a lovely Buddhist expression, and my wife, who's in the room, can help me with this, but I interpret it as this. When you lose, don't lose the lesson. Take all of your failures as a thanks for getting you to the next level, because you're going to learn from it. If you don't learn from your failures, well, that's a big mistake. But all of them are getting you somewhere. And I have an old friend, the producer of Beauty and the Beast, Don Hahn. He wrote a book called Brainstorm, which I highly recommend for any creative person. It is a great book for anyone who's creative. And he has an entire chapter that effectively says, fail early, fail often.
Yes.
Because the sooner you get the failures out of the way, the quicker you get to the successes, because you've learned from all of them.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So you got to experiment. And that's really hard when you're young, because you're afraid of making a mistake and being judged, and you think, oh, they'll never hire me again. Get it out of the way now when you're 21, not when you're 67.
Exactly.
That's a bad time to take a risk for the first time.
Right, yeah, no, for sure. For sure. Sitting in a chair all day for work, a lot of the time, and often in dark rooms, as we know. Is there anything you do with your physical, is there anything you do to help with your physical and mental health? And what do you do to protect your hearing long term?
Oh, great questions. No one's ever asked me that. And that's really vital information to get out to the community.
Yeah.
Well, I do sit a lot. I do know, I have been very athletic most of my life. And so up until around 57 years old, I was an active soccer player. I played outdoor and indoor soccer is often 3 times a week. And that kept me in great shape for the longest time until I had a ligament injury that I couldn't come back from. And the doctor said, you can't play soccer anymore.
Yeah.
So now my wife and I go on long walks, and that keeps me. But I learned in that process from doctors that it's vital for your muscles to get up every 20 minutes. So though I sit a lot, I'm always up every 20 minutes, not to do much of anything other than to walk around the room or walk down the hall, and then I sit back down and work. One thing I've done religiously for 47 years is take a break in the afternoon and take a nap. For a number of reasons. I usually have kind of postprandial, food coma, and it's nice to take a break and let that work itself out. But I also understand. I take that opportunity to go into almost a transcendental state, because I know from reading that creativity has a harder time presenting itself if you don't create an empty space for it to be introduced. And what I try to do is every day around 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, lie down on I've always had a big couch in my office, and I always take some kind of nap or like TM break, and try to just turn off the chatter in my head. It's a good way to reset yourself to jump back into whatever you're right in the middle of. But it also does that, it induces and encourages boredom. And the moment I know I'm fighting boredom, that's the moment I know I'm doing the right thing. And that's a hard message to send today, because it's so easy to be overwhelmed with stimulus. We're all of us. I am so much more enervated by my devices than I was 40 years ago. I was like, I'm constantly saying to myself, I got to stop looking at. I'm looking at a phone, so you can't see this on the microphone. I just got to turn all this stimulation down or off. And I'm not saying that as like the old grandpa, like get off my lawn. I'm saying it as You need this as a creative reset, and you have to encourage boredom to present itself. And the more you do that, the more you'll find the fresh ideas start just popping in.
Right. Yeah. And what about your hearing? Do you do anything to help protect that?
Yeah. On loud films like the Dunes and Blade Runners and Mad Maxes, I will design and edit and mix. In fact, part of my process is that when I'm in my design suite, I am editing and designing and mixing all at the same time. I'm just attacking a problem or a challenge and making it exactly the way I want my filmmaker to hear it on the day we premiere the movie. And as I'm doing that, I'm usually monitoring at a lower level, get geeky. I'm usually down at 82 or 81 SPL. Yeah. And that, I just know that then when I bring it back up to 85, it's going to have a little bit more punch. Yeah. And meanwhile, I'm relaxing my ears. I get my ears checked every year.
Yeah. Are they insured?
No. And my wife can attest, when I go to any kind of public concert, I always wear ear protection because it's just extraordinary to me how loud even a basketball game, the PA, those line arrays are just piercing, and that'll just crunch your ears. Yeah, you'll lose it way before you should.
Right.
I'm just, if you and I were sitting out on the street at a restaurant, if a fire engine went by, I'd put my fingers in my ears. Yeah. I try to protect myself from loud ambient sound.
Right on. That's great. Okay, I have one last question for you, and admittedly I added this after the screening yesterday because they asked Sam this. But what is your favorite sound, or do you have a favorite sound?
I was glad Sam fielded that question last night because I didn't have an answer for it last night, nor did Sam, if you remember.
Yes, I do, yeah.
But this morning I realized what it was. It is not anything granular within the film itself. All of that sound is I'm proud of, but what I'm most proud of is the soundtrack in its entirety, in and of itself, because it's a byproduct of Sam believing that sound had to be foundational for the entire film. The movie, I think, is successful and sounds as good as it does because Sam invested in sound as part of his filmmaking process. So I don't know if this is corny or not, but I'm just saying the whole soundtrack is great because we decided that, and I know it's a movie about sound, but I know if the next movie Sam is making, we're going to do the same thing. Yeah. We're going to invest in sound as part of his process. And that's a success. And I think that's a teaching moment and a learning moment for certainly the documentary community, and I would say the filmmaking community at large, that when you invest in sound that way, the results can be extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. And it was a pleasure talking to you. And
thanks, Matt.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming down.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.